What would you do if your child's happiness clashed with everything you believed in? Richard Caldwell never came home early. His schedule was tight, his priorities clear. Every minute was accounted for meetings, investments, power lunches, and late nights at the office, ensuring his name stayed synonymous with success. He had worked too hard to let distractions steer him off course that day. However, a last-minute meeting got canceled. It was rare, almost unheard of, for him to step through his front door before sunset as he loosened his tie and walked through the vast, marble-floored hallway of his estate. Something caught his attention through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room. He saw movement at first. He assumed Ethan was playing around, maybe jumping on the couch again, something he had repeatedly been told not to do. But when Richard took a step closer, his brows furrowed. Ethan wasn't playing, he was dancing, and he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, barefoot on the polished wood, was Miriam. Their housekeeper, a woman Richard had barely exchanged more than a few words with in all the years she had worked for them. Yet there she was, moving with a grace that seemed almost effortless, guiding his son's hands, adjusting his posture, encouraging him to feel the rhythm of the music that played softly from a speaker. Ethan followed her lead, his small frame mimicking her movements with a focus Richard had never seen before. But it wasn't just the dancing that struck him. It was Ethan's expression, pure joy, unguarded and free. His son, usually so reserved, so cautious in everything he did, was laughing. His shoulders, always tense, were relaxed. Richard's first instinct was to step in to put an end to whatever this was. His son had no business learning how to dance, especially not from the housekeeper. But something made him pause. He had never seen Ethan this alive before. Still, Richard couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. This wasn't part of the plan. Richard stepped back, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as he watched them. His fingers tapped against the cold surface, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure how to answer. Why was this happening? Why was she teaching his son? And more importantly, why did Ethan look so happy doing something that had nothing to do with his future? For years, Richard had mapped out every step of Ethan's life. The best schools, the right extracurricular activities, chess, piano, coding, things that mattered, things that would give him an advantage. But dancing, that wasn't part of the blueprint. His father would have never allowed it. Richard clenched his jaw, his mind flashing back to his own childhood. His father had been strict, unyielding. There was no room for nonsense, no space for distractions. He had been raised to be efficient, to excel, to dominate. It had worked. He was one of the most successful men in Austin, Texas. He had built this life so his son wouldn't have to struggle. So why did it feel like Ethan was flourishing in a moment that had nothing to do with Richard's carefully laid out plans? He exhaled sharply. Maybe this was just a phase. Kids were easily distracted. That's all this was, something temporary. Still, a flicker of something uncomfortable settled in his chest, because deep down Richard knew his son, and he couldn't ignore the truth staring him in the face. Ethan wasn't just doing this to pass the time. He cared about it. That night, Richard barely touched his dinner. Ethan, on the other hand, was buzzing with excitement, shoveling food into his mouth, between animated bursts of conversation. Something that rarely happened. Dad did. You know, Miriam used to be a dancer. A real one, like she performed on big stages and everything. Ethan said, his eyes wide with admiration. Richard's gaze flicked up from his plate. Is that so? His tone was neutral, but his curiosity was piqued. Miriam, who was clearing the table, paused. There was something in her expression, hesitation, maybe even embarrassment. It was a long time ago, she said softly. Ethan, oblivious to the tension, continued. She's amazing. She showed me this move today, and I actually got it right. I mean, not perfect, but way better than before. Richard studied Miriam. He had never thought much about her life outside of work. She had been in their home for years, but to him she was just there. Someone who cleaned, cooked, made sure everything was in order. Not someone with a past, a passion, or a story. He set his fork down. You were a dancer. Miriam straightened her fingers, tightening slightly around the dish she was holding. Yes, I trained in ballet and contemporary dance. I performed for a while, toured. Even Richard arched a brow. And, you're here. There was no malice in his voice, but the words hung heavy in the air. Miriam gave a small nod, Life doesn't always go the way you think it will. Silence. Ethan, sensing the shift in tone, looked between them. Dad, you should have seen her today. She's incredible. Richard glanced at his son. His reserved, careful, always following the rules son now brimming with enthusiasm. Ethan had always been quiet, more comfortable in the background, but now there was a light in his eyes that Richard hadn't seen before. It unsettled him, because it meant this wasn't just a phase. This was something real, and Richard wasn't sure what to do with that. But pretending it didn't exist wouldn't make it go away. The next morning, Richard was back in his element, his world where things made sense, the towering glass office, building the scent of fresh coffee, the steady hum of productivity here. There were no surprises, no unpredictability, at least that's what he thought. So Richard Daniel Whitmore, a longtime business associate, leaned back in his chair, swirling the bourbon in his glass. They were having lunch at the Capitol Grill in downtown Austin, a usual spot for men in their circle. Heard something interesting about your kid? Richard barely looked up from his phone. Yeah, Daniel smirked. My wife ran into your housekeeper the other day. Says she's been giving your boy dance lessons. He chuckled, shaking his head. Didn't peg you for the type to let that happen. Richard tensed. He kept his face neutral, but something about Daniel's tone, the underlying amusement, the condescension rubbed him the wrong way. He forced a small laugh. It's nothing serious, just something he's playing around with. Better hope so, Daniel said, setting his drink down. No offense, but you don't want your kid getting too into that kind of thing. Won't exactly help him run Caldwell Investments. One day Richard exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening around his glass. He had known Daniel for years. They had built their businesses side by side, shared cigars on yachts, toasted to million dual deals. Their sons went to the same elite private school, played the same sports, walked the same carefully paved path, toward deep power and influence. Dancing, that wasn't part of the equation. I'm sure Hune grow out of it, Richard said coolly, taking a sip of his drink. Daniel grinned. Good, would hate to see the kid waste his time. The conversation moved on market trends, investment opportunities, but Richard wasn't really listening, because for the first time in a long time, he didn't like the man sitting across from him. Daniel sounded just like his father, and for the first time Richard wasn't sure if that was a good thing, but ignoring it wouldn't make the question in his mind go away that night. Richard sat in his dimly lit home office, staring at his computer screen, but the numbers and reports meant nothing. His mind was elsewhere, back at that restaurant, back in that conversation, back to the weight of Daniel's words. Would Ethan really grow out of this? Or was that just what he wanted to believe? A soft knock on the door. Him from his thoughts, Miriam. She rarely came to his office. She rarely spoke unless necessary, but tonight she stood in the doorway, her posture composed, yet firm. Can I speak with you for a moment, Mr. Caldwell? Richard gestured to the chair across from him, but she didn't sit. Instead, she exhaled, clasping her hands in front of her. I don't mean to overstep, she began carefully, but I feel like I need to say something. Richard leaned back in his chair. Go on. She hesitated, as if weighing her words. Then finally, I know what people like you think of people like me. Richard's brow lifted slightly, but he said nothing. You see me as your housekeeper, someone who cleans up after you, who makes things easier, who stays in the background. She paused, and that's fine. That's the job, but just because I work for you doesn't to mean I don't know things. His jaw tight. And what exactly do you think you know? Miriam didn't flinch. I know what it's like to have something you love, to have a gift, and to be told it doesn't matter because it doesn't fit into someone else's vision for your life. Richard's fingers tapped against the desk. This isn't about you. She shook her head. It's about Ethan, and it's about you. Silence. I see him, Mr. Caldwell. She continued, voice steady. I see the way he lights up when he moves, the way he feels, the music. I see what you don't want to see. She took a small step forward, and I see the way you look at him when he dances, like it scares you. Richard let out a slow breath, his chest tightening. He didn't like how well she could read him. I know what happens when people are forced to let go of the things that make them feel alive. Miriam said, I lost my chance, but he doesn't have to. Richard swallowed his throat dry. And what if this isn't what's best for him? Miriam studied him for a long moment. Then softly, what if it is? She didn't wait for a response. She simply turned and walked out, leaving Richard alone with the question that was now impossible to ignore. But the real question was he brave enough to answer it? The next morning, Richard did something he never did. He cleared his schedule. No meetings, no calls, no business lunches. Just time. Time to face what he had been avoiding. He found Ethan in the living room, the same place he had seen him dancing with Miriam. But today Ethan was alone. The music played softly in the background, and his small frame moved through the steps. Miriam had taught him. His focus was intense, his movements careful, but full of feeling. Richard just watched. Ethan hadn't noticed him yet, and for a moment Richard felt like an outsider in his own home, peering into a world he had never thought to step into, a world that belonged to his son. Then Ethan caught sight of him in the reflection of the window. He froze mid-step, his face shifting from surprise to something more uncertain. I was just practicing, Ethan said, quickly rubbing the back of his neck. I know it's not a big deal. Richard held up a hand. It is a big deal. Ethan blinked. Richard stepped forward. You love this, don't you? His son hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Richard studied him for a long moment before exhaling. Then I want to see what you can do. Ethan's eyes widened. Wait, really? Richard gave a small nod. Show me for the first time. Ethan didn't look like the nervous, careful kid Richard had spent years shaping. He looked free. The music started again, and this time, Richard really watched. He saw the confidence in Ethan's movements, the way his body spoke, in ways words never could. He saw joy, purpose, something real. And suddenly it didn't matter what Daniel Whitmore thought. It didn't matter what the world expected. This wasn't about Richard's legacy. It was about letting his son build his own. But was Richard truly ready to let go of control? Later that evening, Richard found Miriam in the kitchen washing dishes. He cleared his throat. You were right. She looked over her shoulder, eyebrows slightly raised. About what? Richard exhaled. About Ethan. About all of it. A small smile touched her lips. But she didn't say, I told you so. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply asked, so what are you going to do about it? Richard didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time he was willing to learn. And that woo as enough. Sometimes we get so caught up in what we think is best for someone, we forget to actually see them. Richard almost let his own fears and expectations take away something that made his son truly happy, but in the end he made a choice to listen, to support, to let go of control. How many times have we ignored someone's passion because it didn't fit into our idea of success? How often do we let society's expectations dictate what's acceptable instead of letting people be who they're meant to be? Maybe it's time to step back, listen, and let the people we love find their own way. Because sometimes the best thing we can do is get out of the way and let them dance.